I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight. I'm Robin Surratt. I'm the president and CEO of Lancaster History. Thank you for coming into town. I know this is not our normal venue, but we just knew with 250 people registered and more online, I think we have about 120 people online, we needed more space. And so we're incredibly grateful to have such good partners in the Lancaster County Convention Center and Marriott Hotel. They switched this room up very quickly today after the Women of Achievement Awards luncheon, which I think is why we have these really fun lights behind me. But I will try and work it into the budget for next year that all of our presentations come with fancy lights. So thank you again, Convention Center friends. And thank you so much, Encore, our tech AV media partners back there in the back with all these amazing extras. Not only are they making us look and sound good, they did it as our sponsors of tonight's program. So we're very, very grateful to them. I'm most excited and proud that tonight's program is our first large scale. We've done several smaller scale programs in collaboration with Franklin and Marshall's Center for Politics and Public Affairs. Stephen Medvec is here with us tonight. President Andy Rich is hosting his first board meeting over a few days right now, so he's not here this evening. But we're just so grateful to have this incredible collegiality and a commitment that we share to programming like this one with Franklin and Marshall. So many, many thanks. We're grateful. And I want to announce our next program. We already have our next one on the books, which is March 24th, 2026. Which is crazy that we're almost there. At the Barshinger Center at Franklin and Marshall College, we'll be hosting Professor Melvin Rogers. He's a professor of political science at Brown University, and he'll be speaking to us on democratic faith and the ties to history therein. I also want to just thank the Ware Institute for Civic Engagement for providing transportation for the students tonight. So if you got here on their bus, glad you made it. Before I introduce Professor Amanda Frost, I have 3 shameless plugs to make. You all know that Lancaster History is a private nonprofit institution, and we're committed to telling a comprehensive history of this community's past. And we do it through programs and lectures and events, interactive experiences at our museums, tours at James Buchanan's home, Wheatland, and we do it with your support. We could not do it without you. You make it possible for us to bring high caliber speakers to the community and do so many things around this wonderful place we call home. So thank you, all of you who support us. And we invite any of you who would like to support us further to join in. We have membership brochures out front, and anybody with a name tag would be happy to talk to you at any point tonight. Shameless plug number 2, I'm sure you've all heard of the Extra Give. It's coming up. It's what, 4 weeks exactly from tomorrow, Tracy Cutler? Yeah. And so, of course, we'll be participating enthusiastically. So as you're roaming around the community that day, thinking about how lucky we are to live in such a special place, you can consider whether or not Lancaster History makes it to your roster of donations. And then lastly, and by no means is this the last thing on my mind, but we, of course, have been working hard on the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy. We're getting close. We're within the line of sight of the finish line. We're aiming for next spring. And of course, our capital campaign continues on that front as well. If you would like to be part of it, we'd love for you to join us. We are under the $1 million mark in terms of what we need for the capital campaign. We need another $3 million for the endowment campaign, but what's a few million? But if you have any interest in supporting this project, we would love to have you be part of it. You can either pick up a brochure outside or visit stevensandSmithCenter.org, or again, flag me down. I'm here all night. So now on to the main event. I am really pleased and proud to introduce Amanda Frost, who has become a friend over these last many years as she's been involved in the planning for the Stevens and Smith Center as part of our Scholars Advisory Committee. Amanda Frost is an historian, scholar, and professor of law at the University of Virginia. She specializes in immigration and citizenship law, as well as U.S. constitutional law. Her scholarship has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as dozens of federal and state courts. And she's been invited to testify on topics of her articles before both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Her non-academic writing has been published in a lot of places. I won't read them all, but They're places you know, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, USA Today, and really practically any other serious news outlet you can think of. Her book, You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers, was named new and noteworthy by the New York Times Book Review and was shortlisted for the Mark Linton History Prize. And she's currently at work on another book on the history of birthright citizenship, which will be published in 2026. So 2026 is going to be a good year. Not only is Professor Frost on our Scholars Advisory Committee, she's a prominent feature in a number of the media components that will be down at the center once we open. So I look forward to her having her star turn when she returns to Lancaster next year. And this is not on her resume, but Amanda can be so frequently seen and heard on prominent news channels and on the radio that Tom has gotten quite accustomed to me texting to say, I'm listening to Amanda Frost right now. And I did a cursory search on my text thread. And just in the last 12 months, it included Amanda Frost is on NPR right now. Amanda Frost, first 5 minutes of the news tonight. Listening to Amanda Frost on Throughline. And my favorite one was enjoying a cocktail and listening to Amanda Frost on PBS. So I know you don't have a cocktail right now, but enjoy listening and watching Amanda Frost here in Lancaster tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I will say, for better or worse, every issue I've ever worked on is on fire right now, including a book that I thought would purely be legal history. And it is not just about the history of birthright citizenship. This book is becoming a bit about what is happening today. But before I begin, I just wanted to say a really warm and heartfelt thank you to Lancaster History for just existing, as well as for inviting me to speak here today, and all the many people that have made this possible: Mabel Rosenheck, Stephen Medvec, Emily Miller, the staff of the Convention Center, and of course, Robin. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we will have after my remarks. And also, of course, a big thank you to all of you for caring, for coming this evening. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments at the end of my presentation. So I'm here today to talk to you about something that's dear to my heart, that occupies my thoughts day and night, which is the story of birthright citizenship and how that principle, that ideal of citizenship at birth, became enshrined in the US Constitution. And as the title of this presentation, which is also the title of my book, as it suggests, I view birthright citizenship, the idea of automatic citizenship at birth based on birth within the borders of the United States, I view that as so important, not just because of the legal status that it conveys, although that is extraordinarily important. It comes with the right to vote, it comes with the right to hold federal and state office, and perhaps most important today, it comes with the right to enter and remain in the United States. But those legal rights are only part of the story. Birthright citizenship, I argue, has shaped our nation culturally and sociologically. To be an American is to be here. It does not turn on ancestry. And that, I think, has deep ties and connection with revolutionary values, the values of this nation that broke away from the idea of an hereditary monarch, that put into our original Constitution of 1787 that we prohibited titles of nobility and prohibited corruption of blood, which was the idea of imposing punishment on the child for the sins of the father. So to me, birthright citizenship brings into our national culture, our sense of who we are as a nation, the idea that you belong if you are here, regardless of ancestry. And that's the story that I will tell you about tonight, drawing on the story of three families that were instrumental in bringing birthright citizenship to the United States. So birthright citizenship was not initially in the US Constitution. There was no definition of US citizenship or who was a citizen in our Constitution of 1787. We did have a requirement that you be a citizen in order to be a member of Congress, a natural born citizen to be president. So it was referenced, but there was no definition. And it wasn't until 1868 that we added birthright citizenship to the Constitution. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which now I have up here on the slide. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. So the story I'll tell you tonight is the story of how these words became enshrined in the Constitution. And it's the story of three families that were essential to bringing this provision into our Constitution and enshrining it in our national psyche. First, Dred and Harriet Scott and their family, who, of course, instigated their famous lawsuit seeking both freedom and to claim citizenship. Then, familiar to everyone here, I am sure, in his home of Lancaster, Thaddeus Stevens and his housekeeper, business partner, friend, and confidant, Lydia Hamilton Smith. And finally, Wong Kim Ark, the child of Chinese immigrants born in San Francisco's Chinatown, who brought a case litigating birthright citizenship up to the Supreme Court at the end of the 19th century. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about these three families and the role they played in enshrining birthright citizenship in our Constitution. Before I do that, I'll just mention, as I'm sure many of you know, that the scope of the Citizenship Clause, that language in the previous slide that's in our Constitution, the scope and interpretation of that clause is now being challenged, and that challenge is before the Supreme Court. On the first day of the Trump administration, he issued an executive order that adopted an interpretation of the Citizenship Clause that would exclude children born to undocumented immigrants and lawful temporary immigrants, such as students or H-1B skilled workers or any other group that was temporarily in the United States. So that question will be heard by the Supreme Court this term. I won't talk about it much in my remarks here, but I'm happy to take comments or questions. And it shows us that the history that I'm talking about is deeply relevant to the debates that we're having as a nation today, if we needed any more evidence of that. All right, so as I said, my talk today will focus on the story of the families instrumental to enshrining birthright citizenship in our Constitution. And I'll start with this family, the Scott family. I'm guessing everyone's familiar with the name Dred Scott, but it was really Harriet Scott, his wife, who was the instigator of the lawsuit. And the other great concern of this family, shared by both, was for the fate of their two children, Eliza and Lizzie. When they brought the lawsuit in 1846, Eliza, their eldest daughter, was 7 years old. And that was the age at which an enslaved child could typically be sold away from the parent, when the view was, at that point, they're self-sufficient and can start doing work for the household. And there was a real risk of this family being separated and sold apart, which was surely a major motivator for this lawsuit. They also knew their rights. Many enslaved people had the ability both to communicate with each other about the various rights they had to seek and claim freedom, as well as their ability to file suit. And remarkably, they won about 40% of the time in St. Louis, where this lawsuit was filed. Enslaved persons filed lawsuits and prevailed. So Dred and Harriet Scott had real hope that they could file this suit seeking their freedom and actually achieve that goal. So they went ahead and filed that lawsuit. It took 11 long years, and they claimed freedom based on the fact that the family had been taken, I think this map shows it best, into free territory, and also that their daughter Eliza had been born in free territory, and finally that Harriet Scott had lived for a time in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania led the nation in terms of enacting laws to try to end slavery in the United States. And in 1780, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, the Pennsylvania legislature said, this freedom that we're fighting for from the tyranny of the king, we realize we're being hypocritical and we should try to grant freedom to the people who live among us as well. And they passed a law that said anyone born in the state after that date was automatically free, and any enslaved person who lived in the state for more than 6 months was free. I have to say, no lawyer picked up on that argument for Harriet Scott, but I think Harriet Scott had an independent claim to freedom, along with the claim that she'd been living in free territory up in what is now Minnesota with her husband and children. So they filed this lawsuit, and in addition to claiming that they were free through the argument that they'd been brought into free territory, they also had to claim, in order to stay in court, that they were citizens. You had to be a US citizen to bring your case in federal court. And so they argued before the Supreme Court of the United States after 11 years of litigation, hoping to prevail on both of those questions, their US citizenship, which gave them the right to be in court, and the claim that they should be free in light of the fact that they had been in free territory. And I'm sure, as everyone knows, they did not prevail in that litigation, and the court ruled against them. And I think the most significant opinion for the purpose of birthright citizenship came from Chief Justice Taney, who is pictured here. Taney ruled against them on every issue, and he expounded at length on the question of citizenship. And in some ways, I think Chief Justice Taney deserves more, I hate to use the word credit, but I think credit is the only word I can think of here for the fact that we now have birthright citizenship in the US Constitution, because it was his opinion that necessitated the constitutional change that followed. Because in his opinion, he said it would be, the Constitution barred citizenship, birthright or otherwise, for any person of African descent, whether they're free or enslaved. He went on to say any person of color couldn't be a citizen. At one point in his opinion, he said any person belonging to a subordinate or inferior class of people couldn't be a citizen. I think that covers just about all of us, maybe other than Taney, who would have been excluded from citizenship. And he said the Constitution would not even allow Congress to grant citizenship to those disfavored groups. So, of course, I'm tongue-in-cheek when I say that Chief Justice Taney should get credit. I think the real individuals who should get credit are the Reconstruction Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, and the nation they led. And I'll just say that Thaddeus Stevens, who had so many great quotes, when he referred to Chief Justice Taney and his opinion, he said, that opinion has damned the Chief Justice to everlasting fame, and I fear everlasting fire. So especially back in the day, those were words that would send a chill down your spine. And of course, he wanted to, right? That's how he felt about that opinion and that jurist. So Thaddeus Stevens was, as you know, the history of this extraordinary man who spent a good part of his life here in this town, in this community. He was born in Vermont to an impoverished mother whose his father left the family when he was about 12 years old. He eventually made his way to Pennsylvania, became a member of the bar, started litigating. He was a brilliant litigator. The stories of his cross-examinations and his ability to convince jurists of his position made him famous before he joined Congress, before he joined the fight to end slavery and to ensure racial equality and to change our Constitution. So he was already an important figure. But in 1865, when I pick up the story again, he was the unofficial leader of the nation. His power was extraordinary. And I'll read to you from a terrific quote from Frederick Douglass, who was the escaped slave turned abolitionist leader. He said of Stevens, quote, "There was in him the power of conviction, the power of will, the power of knowledge, and the power of conscious ability, qualities that made him more potent in Congress and in the country than even the president and the cabinet combined." And I think that quote really captures how important Thaddeus Stevens was to the nation, particularly during the Reconstruction era. So let's go back to December 1865. We have the 39th Congress about to start its work. The war is over. The 13th Amendment has been ratified, ending slavery. But we have now what Thaddeus Stevens realized was a race for citizenship, a race between the 4.5 million formerly enslaved Americans who were now free, but they were not citizens, right? Dred Scott, that decision had said they could never be citizens. And then we had another group. We had the former leaders of the Confederacy. And they were not citizens either because they had expatriated themselves. 4 years before, they had stormed out of the Capitol. They had formed their own nation with their own flag, their own constitution, their own army, and they had fought to become a separate nation. And now they were trying to rejoin Congress and rejoin the nation. And Thaddeus Stevens realized that, in fact, in a great irony, they were poised poised to take on more power than they'd ever had before. Because when slavery had existed, all of those 4 million African Americans who were living in the South, they were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining representation in Congress. And now that slavery was over, they would all be counted as a full person, giving the South even more seats in Congress. And yet, if they were not citizens, they would never vote or hold any political power. So Thaddeus Stevens knew that he had to change this, along with some of the other leaders of the Reconstruction Congress. He formed the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, and he is not given credit for this in any of the work I've seen, but he was the first person to propose adding birthright citizenship to the US Constitution. He did it in a closed-door meeting of that joint committee on January 20th, 1866. And at the time, those 15 people, those 15 members of Congress who were attempting to rewrite the Constitution and reconstruct the nation, they had agreed to do this in secrecy, that they would not talk publicly about what happened in those meetings. And they kept a very bare bones journal that was actually lost for years. So I think it's only recently that we even could have known that Thaddeus Stevens was so essential and took this leadership role in proposing the addition of birthright citizenship to the US Constitution. And present at that meeting were the other members who eventually did officially and publicly propose making that addition to the Constitution. But Thaddeus Stevens did it first. And I think that's because he knew that was the principle, the universal rule of birthright citizenship that was needed in order to both overcome Dred Scott and ensure that no future jurist or president could say that somebody from an inferior or subordinate group, whoever that might be, couldn't be a citizen. So the Reconstruction Congress continued its work. They enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which not only declared in the first sentence that everyone born in the US was a citizen. This was a statute, not a constitutional provision, but it was an important addition to our US code. And then it also said that everyone who was a citizen had the right to do things like make contracts, bequeath property, purchase and sell real estate, access court, testify in court, all of the rights that had been denied, certainly the enslaved, as well as even free persons of color. So a story about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Congress proposed it. Thaddeus Stevens took the lead, as he so often did. The president, President Johnson, then vetoed it. He was opposed to most of these Reconstruction measures. And then the Senate overrode his veto on a Friday. This was in April 1866. And later that day, later that evening, Ulysses S. Grant held a party at his home in Washington, D.C., a mile from the Capitol. And I think somebody must have screwed up the guest list at this party, because at this party was Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, many military leaders of the North, obviously Ulysses S. Grant, one such leader, who Alexander Stephens had been trying to slaughter on the battlefields, right? Just not even a year before. That was awkward enough. Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was there in his diary, he wrote, "This was a party like no other," and he didn't mean it in a good way. So then you have President Johnson show up, and no one thought he'd show his face. Just a few hours before, Congress had overridden his veto of the Civil Rights Act, showing who was in charge, and it was them and not him. Nonetheless, he shows up. He then inserts himself into the receiving line next to the Grants. That's the kind of guy he was. And just when they probably thought things couldn't get worse, General Grant and his wife, Thaddeus Stevens and Lyman Trumbull walk in at 10 p.m. at night. Just a few weeks before, President Johnson, in off-the-cuff remarks made from the balcony of the White House, had called Stevens a traitor to his country, which was shocking to the nation. Stevens said it must have been a hoax. He was joking about it. Others said maybe Johnson was drunk, which he'd been before at Lincoln's inauguration. And now these two men were coming face to face at this party. And this was an era when there was plenty of political violence and things could get out of hand. But Thaddeus Stevens never lost his cool in public. And he knew he'd won this battle with Johnson, right? He'd showed who was in charge. So he greeted him civilly enough, and the party continued. But I often think, boy, I'd like to have been a fly on the wall at that particular event. So of course, then we come in May of 1866 to the addition of the Citizenship Clause to the US Constitution. The 14th Amendment had been drafted. It was close to completion when Jacob Howard stood up on the floor of the Senate. He'd been there when Thaddeus Stevens suggested adding birthright citizenship to the Constitution back in January, and he proposed very similar language, the language you saw of the citizenship clause that I posted in my first slide. And he said we should add this to the 14th Amendment to ensure that we overrule Dred Scott, that all of those freed slaves and everyone else born in the US is a citizen. And he said the only exceptions will be the typical common law exceptions for children of diplomats who are quasi-sovereign entities within the United States, immune, right, diplomatic immunity from US law. In addition, children of occupying armies, which happily we haven't had since 1812, but those children would be excluded from birthright citizenship. An invading occupier should not be able to have children in the US who are citizens. So that was a common law exception that had existed since the Middle Ages to this rule. And then finally, they debated and decided to accept from citizenship the children born within Native American tribes out of respect for the sovereignty of Native nations. There were many acts of Congress during this era that were hardly friendly to Native Americans, but I think the exclusion from birthright citizenship was actually a respectful decision to acknowledge that Native Americans might not want citizenship and had their own citizenship within our nation. And that was it. And then, as they're debating this provision, and they didn't spend much time on it, an hour or two. I've spent way more time talking about this provision than they did. I think they thought it was fairly straightforward and fairly clear. But this Congress, Edgar Cowan, a senator from Pennsylvania, stood up. He was not a friend of Reconstruction. He was opposed to just about everything that the Reconstruction Congress wanted to do, and he was usually in the minority and outvoted. But he stood up. He was quite useful in this debate because he said, you can't mean this, can you? Do you plan to give citizenship to the children of all immigrants, including Chinese immigrants who are invading, those were his words, the West Coast? And they were about 10% of the population of California at the time. They'd come during the gold rush and then to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. And so Chinese immigrants had come to the California, at first welcomed, later vilified after an economic downturn. And he knew this, and he said, you can't mean to give them citizenship, can you? This provision would seem to do that. And Senator John Conness, who was himself a naturalized citizen, he was the 14th child of an Irish couple who moved their entire family to the United States at the same time that about 2 million other people from Ireland moved to the US in the 1840s and 50s during the famine. John Conness, naturalized citizen, aware of the value of citizenship, and now senator from California, he stood up and he said, this provision gives citizenship to the children of any parentage whatever, was his quote, including, of course, the Chinese immigrants in California. And this is the moment that I think is so important because birthright citizenship, I argue in my book, it is connected to a long-standing, really feudal rule that said peasants born on a king's land are his subjects, but it is importantly different. I argue it, in fact, that it's an American invention created to resolve two American problems. One was to end the caste system that was the legacy of racialized slavery. And the other was to integrate the children of immigrants arriving in waves from around the globe into the United States. Those were the two goals, and that made it different from everything that came before. And that's what they said they were doing when they added it to the Constitution back. They drafted it in 1866, and it was ratified in 1868. And this, to me, is very poignant. This is a picture of Thaddeus Stevens being carried into Congress in July of 1868, just I think it was 3 weeks before he died. He was carried and he couldn't walk. He was so ill that he couldn't walk by on his own two legs into Congress, but he was carried in. And in fact, for about a year, he'd been carried in so he could complete the work of Reconstruction. And he cast his vote as Congress, joining the rest of Congress to cast their vote to add the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And it was a pro forma vote because 3/4 of the states had ratified it and it was automatically part of the Constitution, but it was an important symbolic moment. He willed himself to stay alive to cast that vote. And I just want to point out, sort of think about this sort of proud man. He was over 6 feet tall. He was strapping and strong in his youth. And now he's being carried in, and everyone would sort of hush and watch. And I think he must have found it maybe a little embarrassing. So being Thaddeus Stevens, he turns to the men who are carrying him and he says, "So who's going to carry me when you young folk are dead and gone?" And it broke, everyone laughed, everyone relaxed, everyone. But I have to say, there's certainly an element of truth to it. I mean, he willed himself to stay alive in this way that just suggests, mind over the body. And he lived far longer than many thought he ever could. And he did it just so that he could see this work of Reconstruction completed. So, that brings me to a couple of puzzles that I have about Thaddeus Stevens that I'm still working through and that I think maybe we'll never resolve. And one is, why isn't Thaddeus Stevens better known? I'm a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer. I have many friends who are civil rights lawyers. I'm a professor. I know many historians. When I say, do you know who Thaddeus Stevens is? The vast majority of people either don't know at all or have a very vague idea of who he is. And of course, I hope Lancaster history is going to change that. And, one of the questions is, why? Why? Well, one answer, and I think it plays no small role, is his handwriting was atrocious. For those who are students in the room, this is a recommendation letter he wrote. I write recommendation letters. They're legible. His was not. You could kind of make out the word trustworthy if you look really hard at this letter, which maybe is all you need. Trustworthy in Thaddeus Stevens' name, and then you hire the guy, right? But he really had terrible handwriting, and that did not help. But of course, the other major reason that his legacy has been lost and warped over time was the abandonment of Reconstruction. The Klansman was a best-selling book made into the movie that was The Birth of the Nation, screened at the White House under Woodrow Wilson's administration, that vilified Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. And there was a great effort to undermine his legacy. And so that's one mystery. Why isn't he better known? What are the answers to that? We can sort of see history playing a role there, and the turn against Reconstruction. But the other mystery about Thaddeus Stevens for me is what changed him, because he became this extraordinary, powerful voice for racial equality, not just abolition of slavery, but racial equality, which is importantly different. And yet he began his life, in Vermont, moved to Pennsylvania, didn't express these views until well into middle age. And in fact, when he was 29 years old, which is not particularly young in my book to come to your sense of what is right and wrong and your ideals and your morals, he represented an enslaver before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and was extremely effective and won a sweeping ruling that not only sent a woman back into slavery in Maryland and her young children, but also created a rule that perpetuated slavery in Pennsylvania for years to come. And he, as I said, he didn't really speak out clearly and strongly in favor of racial equality until his mid-40s. And I think humans are complicated. As Thaddeus Stevens himself said, I live among men and not among angels. And he was not an angel, and he evolved over time. And there's many reasons why he may have changed and evolved and come to the conclusions that he did by the end of his life. And one of them, I think, is this woman, Lydia Hamilton Smith. She moved to Lancaster in the mid-1840s to become his housekeeper. She was born in Pennsylvania to a free woman of color and to an unknown white father. She was an illegitimate child. There was never an acknowledgement of who her father was. And she herself was born to a woman of color and was identified as a woman of color. As you can see from this photograph, she could, quote unquote, pass, but she never did that. She never claimed to be white, and no one ever identified her as such. She married and had children, and then left her husband with her 2 children and became Thaddeus Stevens' housekeeper. And over the years, they became very close friends, confidants, business partners, which I think is very important to this story, her business dealings. They raised together, and I'm sure she did a lot of the work, her 2 children plus his 2 nephews who were about the same age. He became guardian for them after they were orphaned. And she stayed in touch with his family, his nephews plus his extended family plus his friends, for the rest of her life, including long after he died. And my supposition is that among the many things that changed Thaddeus Stevens, that helped him evolve in his views of race and equality, was watching her walk through this world, right? He could see that she wasn't given the education that he was, even though she was whip smart. She had a mind like a steel trap, said a person who got to know her at the time. But she didn't have a formal education. Her writing was halting. She managed to succeed in business without it, but she was the rare case. He could see that her children, her sons, couldn't get the education that his nephews could get. And he fought for equality in education throughout his life, and in his will left a bequest for that, which this community benefits from to this day, I believe. He could see that she needed the right to go to court. She was actually very litigious. She did not hesitate to file lawsuits. And he could see that that was essential to her ability to protect her interests, including also the ability to testify in court. And he could see, and he himself engaged in business dealings with her where they made contracts. He rented a carriage and horse from her because she ran that business. He sold her property that she then rented out at a profit. And so watching her walk through the world, he could see the Civil Rights Act of 1866 with all its protections for access to courts and contracts and bequests and purchase of property and real estate and testifying in court. Those were rights he could see through her experience living side by side, working and traveling with him, were essential. And actually, speaking of travel, they traveled together back and forth from Lancaster to Washington, D.C. on the train. And Pennsylvania had rules requiring segregated railroad cars. And Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith and others helped to fight against that. And in 1867, Pennsylvania ended those laws, in part because he could see she needed to be able to travel with him, and it was wrong to send her to a different car just because of her race. And he helped to fight and end that, as did she. And Pennsylvania did end it, in part due to their advocacy. So at every turn, she was a living example of someone who needed the rights of citizenship there beside him. And I tend to think that influenced him. She was also essential, frankly, just to keeping him alive. His doctor, a man named Henry Carpenter, lived in this town, lived in Lancaster, testified in court that she was essential to extending Thaddeus Stevens's life. And of course, those last few years are the years in which he was instrumental in adding the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution with its citizenship clause. I'll tell you one final scene about her that I think is so important to understanding her. And we have so few glimpses in the historical record of who she was. But back in February of 1866, so this is the spring in which everything happened, the Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, that crazy party at General Grant's house, like all of this was going on. She storms into the Lancaster Intelligencer, which is a newspaper located just around the corner from where she lived with Thaddeus Stevens. And she was furious. And we only have their account of what happened. And I don't trust their account, but you can kind of see glimpses of who she was in their account. And they said she arrived with a wonderfully self-important air and declared that they were lying about her and Thaddeus Stevens, which they were. Whenever they reported on Thaddeus Stevens, they would put Honorable Thaddeus Stevens. That was his title as a member of Congress. And they put a question mark after the honorable. And that's just one example of the things they did to besmirch the two of them. And she was furious. And she said, according to them, she said, I have many backers in this town, white backers at that. And they said, well, why didn't you bring them here then? And she stormed out, furious after saying they had to stop spewing lies about her and Thaddeus Stevens. But what I find interesting is I don't believe most of what this story would say about her or what this paper would say about her, but I believe that what she did that most offended them was that she considered herself the equal of the white man who ran the Lancaster Intelligencer and possibly even the superior. And that came through loud and clear to them in that encounter. And that's how she lived her life. And many people said this about her. She socialized and was treated as an equal, in part because Thaddeus Stevens insisted on it, and in part because she carried herself with that force of power of personality. I've written an article about her in which I entitled it Seizing Citizenship. And I think that's exactly what she did. The story, I think, is a human story, right, of the relationship between these two people and how together they forged this extraordinary constitutional change. And the last thing I'll say about the two of them together is Thaddeus Stevens. I've given talks about Thaddeus Stevens to many different law faculties, to many different history faculties. And I believe it to be true. Certainly no one has said otherwise. Thaddeus Stevens is the only person responsible for significant constitutional change. He's our only framer of the Constitution who had a close and egalitarian relationship with a person of color. And I think that affected him. So, of course, the 14th Amendment became part of our U.S. Constitution in 1868. Birthright citizenship, everyone born in the U.S. as an automatic citizen, became the law of the land, overruling Dred Scott and applying to the children of immigrants. Which brings me to the very last piece of this story. I'll skip ahead here to Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark is the child of Chinese immigrants, born in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1870. So his life didn't overlap with Thaddeus Stevens. He was born after the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause became law of the land. He did overlap with Lydia Hamilton Smith, and no reason they would ever have met. They were on different coasts, but I like to think of the fact that they were both together in this fight in our nation. And he grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown. His parents moved back to China. He remained in the United States working, but he visited his family in China every 4 or 5 years by steamship. And he knew that he was a citizen of the United States based on his birth in the United States. But in 1882, the US Congress passed a law that barred most Chinese immigration to the United States in response to this anti-Chinese animus that was sweeping the nation and certainly the West Coast. But again, Wong Kim Ark knew that he was a citizen at birth. This law didn't apply to him. It applied only to non-citizen immigrants from China. So he leaves for China, visits his family, comes back about 6 months later, and he's barred from entry because he's been made the test case by the US government, which wants to challenge birthright citizenship. They particularly were targeting children of Chinese immigrants. That was the goal. To prevent what they called a loophole to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was that people born in the US to Chinese immigrant parents were citizens who could not be barred. And so they were testing the constitutional scope and interpretation of that citizenship clause, and they wanted to bring that test case up to the Supreme Court. This man, Holmes Conrad, was Solicitor General of the United States at this time. He was the one who pushed this litigation. He pushed this test case challenging birthright citizenship using Wong Kim Ark as that test case. And his history is fascinating. He was himself born into a wealthy Virginian family, a slave-owning family. He was an officer in the Confederate Army. And he was still fighting the Civil War in bringing this lawsuit. And in fact, before the US Supreme Court, he made a couple of extraordinary arguments. He said, no children of any immigrant, any non-citizen could be a citizen of the United States. That was a sweeping assertion. And in fact, the Supreme Court had to put off the oral argument in the case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. They had to put it off until after the elections, because the argument being made by the Solicitor General of the United States would have taken away citizenship from thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of voters whose parents were immigrants, of office holders, people running for office whose parents were immigrants, who would no longer be citizens if this man had prevailed in his argument before the Supreme Court. He also made a second argument, which didn't land well with the court, which was he argued the entire 14th Amendment was unconstitutional because the South had been coerced into ratifying it. And again, when I presented this to various law faculties, I say, does anyone know of any other example of the Solicitor General of the United States arguing before the Supreme Court that the Constitution is itself unconstitutional? No, right? This argument did not fly. However, there was a lot of concern about how this case might come out, in part because the Supreme Court deciding it, the Fuller Court, this was a court that was not friendly to Chinese immigrants. It was openly hostile. 2 years before, in 1896, it had issued a decision called Plessy versus Ferguson that had upheld separate but equal and established Jim Crow as the rule in the United States until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 finally overruled it. This was not a friendly court to arguments for equality. And this was not a court that was friendly to the ideals of Thaddeus Stevens and the Reconstruction Congress. And This case took over a year to decide, which was far longer than usual for that time in particular. And people weren't sure how it would come out. In the end, Wong Kim Ark won his case. And I think he did so, I'm sorry to say, I think he did so because his lawyer very wisely made the argument, if the Solicitor General of the United States is correct, that the children of immigrants are not citizens, it will take citizenship away, not just from the children of the Chinese immigrants, but also from the British and the German and the Irish immigrants. The court repeated that line in its opinion. And I think that is in part what won the day. But there's one other reason that Wong Kim Ark won his case. And if you read the opinion, which is very long, so I don't recommend it, but if you read the opinion, you'll get this from it, which is Thaddeus Stevens in the Reconstruction Congress wrote the citizenship clause to be so clear and so absolute that no one could question it. So I'm going to end this talk by reading to you that clause, the same clause I began this talk by reading aloud. And just take a second and listen to the clarity of this language. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Thank you.
How are we doing? Okay. We'll switch. Thank you so much. If you want to hear more about the Wong Kim Ark story from Amanda's perspective, Google Throughline and Amanda Frost. And it's great. I listened to it while walking on a beach in Aruba, and I had to keep going past where I was staying because I wasn't done listening. And it explained things for me in a way that actually I hadn't really grasped the entire story in such an approachable manner as after listening to this. So really, there's more to be had out there. Just a sidebar, I think we have like $980,000 left on our capital campaign. And if I had a time machine and I could auction off the opportunity to go to that party in 1866, I think I could close this out. I mean, really, like that, I wanted to ask how much you would pay to be at that party, but you kind of said you want to be the fly on the wall. So I'm going to start with a you question, and then we'll get into some Stevens and others, and really just go with the personal. What got you interested in immigration law and in the history of immigration law?
I think I've always been fascinated by immigration law, and that's beyond citizenship, which I also find it particularly interesting and encompasses all the rules and policies that we've had over the course of US history. And of course, today, I mean, I'm a practicing immigration lawyer as well as a law professor. So you think about these rules and policies a lot. And I always start my immigration class by saying, if you look at the population of the United States today, about 15% of the population is foreign born, and another 10% are the children of foreign born, of immigrants, which means 25% of the nation has been made and remade generation after generation by our immigration laws. And it's an existential question, right? What should those laws and policies be? And I should add, I think it's a very complicated question. People on the extremes say things like, either open borders or close the borders, no one comes in. Neither one of those is the good answer. The actual answers to those questions are complicated and thorny and involve law and policy and the values of our nation. And we get into those debates in my classes, and I'm fascinated by it. So that's really what got me interested. I feel like immigration is a driver of the United States. It created our nation. It's our superpower, I think. And that fascinates me. I'll add, there was nothing particularly personal about my own life that made me think, oh, I wasn't the child of immigrants myself. But since I started teaching about 10 years in, I actually figured out my own ancestry. And there's some fascinating immigration stories in my ancestors. And that's true of all of us. That's the thing about immigration. The stories that underline those sometimes desperate flights from foreign countries to the United States are precious, and we all have them.
Immigration is such a huge part of the Lancaster story. And so I often think how resonant and perfect it is that Thaddeus Stevens, even if he didn't know it, was right in the heart of a community that was going to end up being a hub, a beacon for refugees and immigrants coming for 160 years after he died. How do you think Stevens would read debates about immigration and birthright citizenship and that have taken place since 1868.
So I debated this question, the question of birthright citizenship and whether it should be constrained or the citizenship clause should be interpreted, as the Trump administration is arguing, to restrict birthright citizenship. I debated this at the National Constitution Center a few months ago. And I said at the end of my opening remarks, and the Reconstruction Congress would be very sad that we are having the debate we are today, because their goal, and they said this, was they said we must make this language very strong and very clear. We must fortify it, was the word that Senator Wade used, so that future generations, if the government falls into different hands, cannot end and reverse the citizenship that we're bestowing. That's what they said at the time. And of course, we are having that debate nonetheless. But I think they would be dispirited because they very clearly wanted universal birthright citizenship. And that's not my spin on it. There's quotes from the legislative history, that say that.
Have other cases been brought since then to either the Supreme Court or to lower courts?
So Wong Kim Ark was the big challenge, right? The case that I described at the end of my remarks, in front of a court that was quite open to hearing that kind of argument. But as I said, the case by the government failed, I think in significant part because of the clarity of the language that the Reconstruction Congress adopted, as well as the consequences, of course, if to immigrants and to the nation if they had ended this rule. So that decision was clear and strong and really led the way. Since then, the Supreme Court has several times said, sometimes just in passing, well, of course, the children of an undocumented immigrant are themselves citizens. So they've said that repeatedly. In a case in 1986 called Plyler versus Doe, they made the point that even unauthorized immigrants are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning they fall within the citizenship clause and their children are citizens. They said in a case called Hintopoulos from 1957, children of undocumented immigrants are citizens. So they said it. It hasn't been the holding of a major Supreme Court case until maybe this term. We'll see it again.
Do you think, in your opinion, is the current attack on birthright citizenship an anti-immigration measure, or do you think it has ties to notions of heritage Americans that seem to assert a Eurocentric view of American citizenship?
I think all of those things. I mean, a couple of pieces about the challenge to birthright citizenship. I think it's of a piece with a bunch of different other initiatives. There's been an initiative, both Trump 1 and this administration, to denaturalize people who are naturalized citizens. We have about 20 million naturalized citizens in the United States. About half of the foreign-born population naturalizes. And that, creates, cast doubt or creates fragility, right? Where those individuals who naturalize no longer feel secure in their citizenship. And as I pointed out, if you're going to say that because maybe an ancestor was here temporarily or came in violation of immigration laws, and you're going to say the children of that person are not citizens, there are many of us who might not pass that test. When I look back at my ancestry, generations back, I found at least one guy who deserted the British Army. I'm kind of proud of him. And, clearly no one used the term at the time, but he was an illegal alien, right? He wasn't supposed to be here. And if we took the Trump administration's arguments to their extreme, all of us would be of suspect citizenship.
Has your understanding of citizenship changed or evolved between your first book project and your current one? And this is an opportunity for whatever shameless plug you want to put in there about your new book.
Well, and I hope it came through in my remarks, and it may not have, but I'll say the first book project, which is called You Are Not American, the title, citizenship stripping. It's about taking away of citizenship. And I didn't mean the book to be terribly depressing, because people fought back successfully with the help of many Americans around them, and they succeeded in keeping their citizenship. And the stories are remarkable. I mean, U.S. citizen women or immigrant women who were citizens who married non-citizens automatically lost their citizenship for about 25 years at the start of the 20th century. And I didn't when I started my research. So I wanted to tell these stories, but that book was, and I get it, depressing to read, right? It was like, wow, we've done a lot of things in our nation's history that we're not so proud of. I hope it came through in my remarks. I think birthright citizenship is something to be celebrated. I think it's a major American accomplishment that we enshrined this principle into our Constitution and that we have lived up to it. And I think it's changed us as a nation in ways that mean that we evaluate people and decide whether they belong based on the fact that they're here and not their ancestry. And that is so important to who we are as a nation. And I'm trying to celebrate it. So the big difference between the books is this book is meant to be uplifting and celebratory. It's now also becoming a little bit defensive because we're at a moment.
We need
of
a little uplift and celebratory. Yeah. So thank you for that. And challenge all at the same time. Are we the only nation that has birthright citizenship?
No, it's both. It's really interesting to watch. And I actually had a slide on this I pulled out, but of the slide deck. But the birthright citizenship first started as like a feudal rule in England, but it was really more about tying peasants to the land. It was subjectship, not citizenship. But still, some European countries had birthright citizenship. Many did not. They only conveyed citizenship through descent. So you could only be German if your parents were German, wherever you were born, and you were not German, even if you were born if your parents were of some other citizenship. And so that's a kinship-based citizenship rule that many European countries had. And over time, now all of Europe has abandoned the purest form of birthright citizenship. The law is complicated, and I won't go into details here. And there are ways that people who are born to non-citizen parents, for example, in France, can acquire citizenship. But there's no automatic universal rule of birthright citizenship in Europe. But all of the Western Hemisphere, almost all, has that same automatic birthright citizenship rule, including Canada and Mexico. So we are different from Europe, I think importantly different, and for the same reasons we had a revolution, frankly. But we share birthright citizenship with the other countries in our hemisphere.
So what became of indigenous rights in terms of birthright citizenship? When did that change?
The story of Native American citizenship is fascinating. It is a book in and of itself. There's so much to be said there about the relationship between Native tribes and the U.S. government. So, of course, basically to take you back to the moment of the American Revolution, 1776, we lived the question of who would be an American, who would be a U.S. citizen when we became a nation, was not clear because we had 20% of the population was enslaved. Then we had a Native American population who didn't want to be citizens of the United States, America. And the Reconstruction Congress, when they created the rule of universal birthright citizenship, as I said in my remarks, I think it was respectful of Native American sovereignty for the most part. The idea was they don't want to be automatic citizens at birth. And it wasn't a race-based exclusion. If an Indian left the tribe and lived outside of the tribe, then that Indian's child would be an automatic citizen at birth. It was only those who were tribal citizens who would not convey automatic citizenship at birth to the children. They were the ones excluded from the Constitution's citizenship clause. And I should add that in 1924, Congress enacted a statute that means that all children born within Native American tribes today are automatic citizens at birth. It's by statute, not by the Constitution, but it's equivalent. For those who maybe were wondering what the situation is today.
Yeah, thank you. This one's a doozy. The Dominican Republic's Constitutional Court revoked birthright citizenship in their country in 2013 and applied the decision retroactively to people born in the country since 1929, which created a statelessness crisis that's still unresolved. Is there any possibility that the U.S. Supreme Court could issue a retroactive decision like this?
I don't know enough to opine too much on the situation in the Dominican Republic, although I will say my understanding is that was targeting the Haitian immigrants and their children who were living in the Dominican Republic. And I think that could be a cautionary tale. I mean, I'll just say a few things. I've been writing amicus briefs and been quite involved in current litigation, which has been in the lower courts and now is reaching the Supreme Court regarding the Trump executive order seeking to restrict birthright citizenship. And I make a few points because I think I'm drawing from the arguments Wong Kim Ark's lawyer made, which is, if you think this executive order will affect just the children of undocumented immigrants, think again. First of all, it will affect the children of temporary visa holders, which includes people who are here for years and are on their way to getting a green card. And that's 15% of our population. And more than half the people who get green cards, allowing them to remain indefinitely, they were here temporarily to begin with. So all those children would be born without citizenship or any status whatsoever, even though their parents are legal and on their way to permanent residence and citizenship. It would create overnight hundreds of thousands of new undocumented immigrants. And then the Trump administration's executive order says they would apply this prospectively only. So only children born after the order goes into effect would be denied citizenship. I have to tell you, that's bizarre. That's not how the Constitution works. If the Supreme Court agrees that the citizenship clause does not apply to the children of undocumented or temporary immigrants, then it never applied to them. It is fully retroactive. And the Trump administration tomorrow could say, we plan to apply it retroactively, but you know what? We'll just wait to see who we don't like, and then we'll look at their ancestry and see if there's a problem there. One of the arguments I make, or the points I make also, is that every single family going forward that has a child will have to prove their ancestry. It doesn't matter if the parents were born in the US, it doesn't matter if their descendants came from the Mayflower. You now have to produce evidence upon the moment of your child's birth that you were born in the United States or that you're a US citizen. And that's, of course, just additional paperwork, but also something that's expensive and difficult. And if you don't do it, your child will be denied the right to remain in the United States, access to federal benefits, a social security number. They could be deported the first day of their lives, and this could affect everyone. So I really try to make those points. It's not just a narrow slice of the population that would be affected. It's everyone having a child going forward, or maybe everyone going backwards.
So historians both love and hate the what if questions. So sorry. How might Lydia view debates about immigration and citizenship taking place today, in your opinion, in your imagination?
Lydia Hamilton Smith fascinates me. As I said, I think in my remarks, I can only get like little glimpses of her from her letters. You know these well. The few surviving letters, the recollections that others have of her, which oftentimes you can't trust, but maybe you see a glimmer of her personality. So drawing from that, and I'm speculating, but I like speculating. I don't mind in this case. I will say that my view of her was she was not someone who wallowed. She was someone who got things done. So, and she had to be kind of cynical about human nature because of what she herself had to deal with in her life. You know, she became sort of famous despite herself due to her connection to Thaddeus Stevens, and she had to deal with many of the negatives that came with that, along with the positives. And I think her view would be get on with it, keep up the fight, don't don't be self-pitying, don't give up, just keep fighting, which is what she did her entire life.
If she had been born in a different time and place, she really would have made a kick-ass lawyer. Maybe she could have been an immigration lawyer. I want to thank you for being here, for being part of this project. I feel like you're so at the heart of much of the work that we've been putting into this. And it's just delightful to have more time with you every time you're in town. You can stay tuned to see Amanda on at least one and maybe two or three of our film pieces at the Stevenson Smith Center. And in the meantime, just thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.